Hello, hi everyone. My name is Esther, and my pronouns are sorry, my cat's my pronouns are she and her, and we are having a conversation today about Black youth and cannabis. So essentially, like the Black experience with cannabis, and yeah, we're all here to have a discussion and share and reflect. And yeah, so once again, my name is Esther. I am 25. My pronouns are she and her. I am situated in the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. I'm a facilitator and a peer leader for Good Sensible, and that's me. If we could all just go around and introduce ourselves, that would be awesome.
Okay, since I'm unmuted. So hello, my name is Kiah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm 25 years old. I'm currently living in Vancouver on the land of the Coast Salish Nations, and I am the project facilitator for the Cannabis and Mental Health Project, which is a project through Cannabis and Psychosis, which is a project through the Schizophrenia Society of Canada. And yeah, I'm excited for this discussion. I've been working in cannabis education for the past 2 years, so I'm really excited to see what unfolds.
I'll go next. I'm Chantal Phillips. I'm 25, and I was born in and currently living in Toronto. I'm at the University of Toronto right now, so that's the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as a medical student, soon-to-be medical professional, like this topic's really important to me. I think it's something we don't talk enough about, and it's so easy for people who enter into like medicine to have control over patients' lives. And so if we aren't very aware of what it means, like good harm reduction as well as like good mental health, then unfortunately, I think there's a lot of disconnects between patients, between people and their doctors. So for me, cannabis is really important to understand and to see as like a coping strategy for many people. And I'm just excited to talk about this a bit more with you.
And I'm Kevin. I'm also situated in Toronto, like Chantal, so I'm acknowledging the same lens. I work at CAMH, which is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and I work in a substance use program for youth who identify as African Canadian, Caribbean, and or Black. So this is definitely a topic of relevance for me and the work that I do, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you everyone for your introductions. So yeah, let's just get right into it. I guess the first kind of conversation I want to have is talking about our experience with cannabis, whether or not we use cannabis or we don't, and reason why. If anyone would want to share first. Or I can go ahead. I can share. So yeah, I use cannabis recreationally and also for my anxiety. It really helps me focus when I'm super stressed out and just having a hard time living life. But yeah, it's pretty much how my use goes.
Yeah, I used to use cannabis a lot. I started like at the age of 15, and I was using pretty much every day until age 20, 21. So it's been a part of my life for a while and a part of my identity. And now like I guess just like my life changing and just like what substances work for me now, I use it maybe once a week in the form of an edible to get a bit goofy with my roommates. Yeah, that's my experience, but we'll get into it later.
Yeah, I don't use cannabis in part for faith-based reasons. I've tried cannabis, and I think like in the context of like social settings, I definitely see the benefit, but I was like always that person who just like wanted to go to sleep. So I think for like recreational purposes, like perhaps it just didn't have the same effect on me. But so I recognize why folks do use it. And I think like there's a lot of stigma associated with it that we'll talk a bit more about. So I also had to like overcome that stigma within myself and figure out like, do I not want to use this because of like faith-based reasons that I believe in and I think are true for myself, or is it because of like the stigma attached to it? in the church. And like after I separated those things, I feel like I was able to make a more informed decision.
I would kind of agree with that for myself. Just for kind of reflecting, as you're asking that, I was like, what? Why do I or do I not use? So I can definitely resonate with that kind of stigma piece. So I know kind of growing up in my youth, I didn't use at all, and I think a lot of that had to do with the stigma and where things were at then. I'm not particularly a cannabis user, even currently. I'd say maybe very occasional social use, but it's not necessarily something that I would use often. But I also do recognize for youth and even older adults as well, where the perceived benefits might be. So I think it's a good conversation to have.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So yeah, I actually honestly, I like just thinking back to what Chantal said, kind of like with that religious aspect to it, because I had a lot of like trouble with that, especially like not growing up in Canada and like having preconceived notions about like drug use and like everything was just bad and there was no reason behind it. So like I did have to do that thing as well where I kind of just like separated the religion from it and just like tried to understand it like out of that. So I definitely like resonate with that. I want to talk a little bit about how, I guess, like for folks who don't use as well, maybe you can like share insight on maybe conversations you've had or things like that. Essentially, how just us being Black has affected our mental health and our use, or just our mental health, because I know that's like a big thing for a lot of people, a lot of communities, is that lack of like understanding or conversation around mental health, specifically in Black communities, where a lot of the time it's just kind of like pushed to the side and like you're seen as like weak, or like if you talk about your mental health or if you actively seek help and things like that for things like therapy and stuff like that. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how did we grow up learning about our mental health, and how were the conversations we had at home, and were they encouraged? Like, was it like just not taught? Like, did you just figure it out by yourself, like when you moved out and things like that? Like, what was that experience like for folks?
Yeah, I think for me, my family life was quite dysfunctional until like more recently, actually. So I saw my parents endure a lot of trauma that they like, it was very visible, tangible impacts on them as people that like as a kid I could see. But I think it was almost like you had to choose whether to just like be strong and resilient or to acknowledge that you have mental health. And it's like you couldn't have both. I recognize now those things are not mutually exclusive, but when I was a kid, it was like, well, you kind of just need to like suck it up, keep pushing, like, especially when you have other structural like inequities or things you're facing. Like when your parents are just focused on trying to keep a roof over your head and food in your belly, it's almost like who has time for mental health when you're just trying to survive? And I think from that perspective, like I did associate as a child, like recognizing anxiety, depression as like, if I have those things, it's because I'm the problem and not because of all of these other things that are happening around me or to me, or even ways that I might enable some of those things to perpetuate because I'm not addressing them. So it actually wasn't until a bit older and realized how anxious of a person I was. Like I wanted to be in control of everything. So I think growing up in a dysfunctional environment, the only way I could have control was to be like the goody two shoes kid, like the kid who did everything my parents said and like was gonna somehow like become this like doctor and like be the one to almost like break the curse. But that's a lot of pressure for a kid to have and to continue to put on themselves. So I think it was when I was anxious and I did not like the person I became. Like I would isolate myself. People did not like me. I did not like myself in those environments. I was just very high strung. Like you could feel the tension in the air when I was there, and I did not like that at all. So it wasn't until like people pointed out to me, but I also kind of took a good look in the mirror and recognized like this. As much as I focused a lot on my parents' trauma, it also caused me trauma that I have to recognize in myself and deal with. So I think to this day, like I'm still working through the things that like this desire for control But I feel more comfortable having conversations about mental health with my parents. And even though they've been hard, they've been more willing to talk about it in the last couple years, I would say.
I think that's a really good point, and it's really common. Like I could just even reflect growing up that I think mental health affects us all, but it's not something that we really named. It was just kind of like, someone might be in a mood, or or you just kind of notice that someone's a little bit more withdrawn or a little bit more agitated or things like that, but no one's really defined it in a way that to go seek help or to kind of speak about it. But I think oftentimes if I reflect on even family and friends, that it results in sometimes suffering and silence, right? So people are going through things and no one wants to talk about it, and that kind of makes the situation worse, right? Whereas just sometimes a simple conversation to say, you know what, like I'm feeling really low right now, I'm feeling depressed, sometimes that would be enough to have solved, just to kind of have that connection with someone who's caring to talk about it. But sometimes even feeling like, this is not something I should talk about because, other people aren't talking about it, right? So.
Yeah, I can add to that. Like, I feel like growing up, there wasn't as much language around mental health and like what that is and what it looks like and what it looks like in you and what it looks like in your family. So growing up, I wasn't really aware of it. And there weren't many conversations until about I was like 12 years old, and my sister started suffering with really bad depression, and she's a few years older than me. And that's when I realized, like, oh, this like isn't just a mood, like Kevin was saying, like she's struggling right now. And then that's when my parents started doing their own research on mental health and mental illness and like what that looks like. And it's like throughout this time, I feel like my family and like extended family has just continue to realize, as Chantal was saying, like the trauma that we've been holding, whether it's generational trauma or trauma that we've endured in this life, like, and we're learning more and more about ourselves. So it's a process that like collectively as a family we're going through, and like I see us maturing together, and having that language has really, really helped. Yeah, and like when I was younger, I was like similar to Chantal, quite anxious, didn't know what to do with it, didn't want to admit that I was feeling strange. And that's when I started consuming more cannabis. It just felt better to feel strange in a different way than to just be anxious sober. So I medicated and smoked a ton of weed to just suppress any uncomfortable feelings. And I could blame any strange emotions or feelings on just being absolutely high. Like I look back and I'm like, wow, I was like not quite there. I wasn't quite with myself, and I wasn't really with my friends. I was super withdrawn. And it took me a few years after, when I moved away and just reflected on my cannabis use when I was younger, and I'm like, oh well, you were like really struggling there, and you didn't know how to put it into words, and you had the substance that helped in the meantime. But yeah, it's like this bi-directional relationship where it helped, but it also affected my mental health in a negative way. So it was very complicated.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with that. I think for me, I like didn't understand or didn't have, like everyone was saying, like know how to define it for a long time, just because like what was mental health like growing up in Nigeria? It wasn't a thing. Like no one talked about it. Like similar to what Kevin said of that, like suffering in silence type of thing. That was like the trend. And like I couldn't name, like I like went through trauma like with like growing up in like an abusive home, and then not understanding how that felt. And like when I came here, and like I still didn't get knowledge or any access to it. And like similar to what Kiah was saying, I started to use just because I was like, I don't know what else to do. And like I'd rather feel like this because I don't get to feel everything I'm feeling, than feel like shitty basically. And then when I like got to university, I started to learn more because like I wasn't like in an abusive relationship, and then I actually had to seek therapy, and then I started to understand mental health. But even when I talk about it with my parents, it was very like, why are you doing this? Like, what's the point? Like, it doesn't, why are you telling everybody your business? Like, just pray, it'll be okay. And like, yeah, like I do agree, like praying helps, but also like therapy also helps. So it was also really hard. And like, I really had to just like keep it to myself. I didn't talk about it with my family for a while because They didn't like the fact that I was going to therapy. They refused to pay for it because they were like, they didn't understand it. And it literally wasn't until last year. This was like 6 years later that they're like, oh, okay, yeah, like we get it now. And like when, I don't know, like it just felt like they only kind of took it seriously when it got to the point where it was like at my peak. And yeah, so I don't know, it was just really interesting. And even like thinking back to even my parents, and like I know like they would do well from like actually talking about their mental health and like going to things like therapy, but they just don't understand or agree with it because of like how like our culture is just based solely on like religion, and like that's the root of everything, and that should be the result of everything, and like nothing is gonna get you through it if God doesn't, and everything. So like yeah, that was my experience. Yeah, it wasn't the best experience.
What faith like were you guys grown up with? Like what faith do your families follow? I'm curious.
I'm Christian.
So am I.
It's just interesting because my cousins are Christian as well, and they don't use substances. And my family, like my parents were both raised Christian, but they like raised me fluidly, I guess. Like I would go to Sunday school, but there was like 3 stars of David, you know. It was quite, it's like we're feeling it. But yeah, just seeing like how like religion like does play into that, like the morality aspect of it. And I don't know, I almost feel like as Chantal was saying, it does give like an opportunity to like reflect on it, and to like, though like there is stigma associated with it, it's, I don't know, I like didn't have that backbone, I guess, to kind of reflect on my use so much. Like I didn't have a faith that I followed, so I wasn't like, oh, is this something that I should be doing or not doing? It was just something that I was just like, this is what I'm doing. And also growing up in BC as well, where cannabis is just so readily available and has been for a while. Yeah, just curious.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I like, even like when you mentioned stigma, I was thinking about just that idea of like, because I don't know, like I know like from my experience it's very different, but like I'm just curious to know, like, has stigma kind of did it affect how you navigated your mental health, like just growing up? Like did it affect you understanding it? Did it make you feel things about your mental health? Like how did stigma play a role in that?
I can speak to a bit of stigma. I'm just going to jump back to the cannabis piece because I'm doing my own little internal reflection process here as we're talking about it. I'm like, what were the factors that kind of influenced kind of my use or not use, right? And I think first and foremost, like at least when I was, in high school, like cannabis was not legal, right? And I can't even count on one hand like how many friends or people that I associated with who are using, and then next thing you know, they're suspended, or there's trouble. And then like I sometimes used to think like, how am I going to go home and explain how I got suspended for, so I'm like, is this just too risky? Let me just stay away from that, right? Like the thought of me going home and telling my mom, like, and my dad, like, I got suspended because I was smoking a joint. Like I couldn't even, that wasn't even an option, right? So I was like, let me just not even, it looks interesting, but let me just look from over here. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think in terms of stigma, even like I was well into undergrad, and I remember my mom saying, like it was, I think I had tried like hookah for the first time, and she was so disappointed in me that I was like 20 and she was so disappointed in me that I shouldn't be laughing. I love my mom so much, but she's like, you can't. And I think it's because a lot of people within my family smoke cigarettes, and for her, like smoking is smoking. And like my grandma now has lung cancer. That spread to her breast. She has breast cancer and lung cancer, and like to see someone in our lives who has cancer because of smoking, I think for her, like she knew that would be a very tangible outcome of it. So being around smoking, whatever form it was, to her was just like, it's a no. She wasn't very strict about a lot of things, but that was one thing, even well into my adulthood, that she stressed. So I think even though it's like the stigma wasn't as much her perception of cannabis as it was like her own experience with family members who struggled with smoking and like some of the physical impacts it has had that have resulted in illness. So I think it was less about like what people would say, like what people at church would say, or, you know, our family would say, and it was more about the potential impacts to my body that she was worried about. So I know it was coming from a good place, but it does still make it challenging to have conversations about it, I would say.
Yeah, I can totally relate to like stigma around, I don't even know, like parents in a way. And when my parents found out that I was like consuming cannabis, I thought I was being really sly and would like smoke out of my bedroom window, hotbox my closet. Like the logic wasn't there. They're like, who's smoking weed? I'm like, it's someone outside. Like, what? It's not, it doesn't make sense. And my dad like came into my room and was really upset one day. And for him, it was like the whole like gateway drug logic. Like he's like, oh, if you're using cannabis, like what's next? And like, you know, took me to East Hastings in Vancouver, which is like really struggling with the opiate epidemic right now. And, you know, like that's his fear, but like it was based in fear. Like his way of going about it, it wasn't like, how are you feeling? Are you okay? It was like, this is gonna be you. Like, this is what happens. And I'm like, holy crap, like we jumped from like 0 to 10 like very, very quickly. And so like that kind of relationship made it so I'm like, oh, I can't talk to my parents about this. Oh, I have to be like secretive about this because it's going to trigger them, and it's going to, you know, just like they're just going to tell me horror stories because there's so much misinformation out there. And like Kevin, when I was in high school, it was illegal. And yeah, and there was a lot of like fear associated with it, and people just like, I mean, a lot of folks still don't know like truly what cannabis is, and we're still finding out the effects of it, especially on developing brains. But yeah, like stigma felt from like family, and like the fear around that is definitely a huge thing because you don't want to disappoint. You don't want to disappoint a Black family because like honestly, worst thing ever. Worst thing ever. Yeah.
Like you hear all the stories of like what it took to like come to Canada, and you know, it's like I can't be that guy to sort of mess this whole situation up.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I hear that weekly, literally weekly, everything I do. Do you know how much it took for us to bring you here? I'm just like, okay, I get it. I honestly resonate with that. I think like for me, my family just like, I'm like, this is kind of like what I want to talk about next as well. Just like our experiences, like how our parents talked about drug use and everything. My mom like just would be like, no, like you are a bad person. You're going to go to hell. You will die. Like so much will happen to you. You're going to end up on the street, like all sorts of things. Like, cause I feel like even like, cause like, I feel like use back home in Nigeria is like a lot different from here. Whereas like only in the past, like 2-ish years that I've seen like more folks like use it, like more people use it in Nigeria. But like when I lived in Nigeria, it was like everyone who used it were like people who were like in gangs or like people who were like murderers and things like that. So it was very associated with just like negative energy and just negative people. So like my mom would be like, if you even think about it, then maybe there's something wrong with you. Maybe you want to like be a bad person if you use weed and things like that, and like or other drugs. And like in that sense, she didn't even understand the drugs or like didn't understand anything about it. She just associated with that thing, and that just made it like difficult. So it was very like fear inducing for sure. And like even when I got to Canada, like similar to like what Kevin was saying, at first like I was in that like that was my only like idea about like weed or like any other drug is like, yeah, like I'm gonna die and like I'm gonna be a bad person. I'm probably gonna go to jail if I use it. So I didn't. And I was like, my friends were all using it and I was like 15. And it was that like thing of like, what am I gonna tell my mom? Like she's all the way in Nigeria. I've been in Canada for a month, but I want to make friends and I want to try this new thing. And I saw someone get expelled for it last week. So like it was just very difficult. And like I feel like not in the sense of like me telling my mom, oh yeah, like I smoke weed or whatever, just like the idea of like her potentially seeing me as like a bad person or like I've disgraced the family and oh I should never have brought you to Canada and things like that. But yeah, I don't know. That was like my experience, like just like being in a household where like drugs were just a no-no and alcohol. Like in my high school graduation, I was like drinking champagne and my mom was so mad. And like she drinks like all the time. Like but like when it's like I guess like when it's like your kid, it's also like very like I don't want you to do these things, like even though like I do them. Because I'm sure my mom like was dipping and dabbling when she was in university or high school, whatever. Like, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know. What was y'all's experience with like I know like we kind of touched on it a little bit, but like with just how our parents kind of talked about like drug use and like the conversations that they had and like I don't know, like this that sort of vibe.
I found a lot of the conversations like they're getting better now because like with like the work I do and just like I feel like the language around people who use drugs is also changing, but very stigmatizing conversations. Like my parents consumed cannabis from time to time. They would have like little joints in their like secret drawer. But yeah, I found like just a lot of the language towards just drug use and drug users in general just to be like really, and I think it's like based like there's like good intention behind it, and it's based in fear and like people, I don't know, people are very scared of drugs and like potential outcomes of it. Yeah, so the conversations were definitely limited, but I definitely noticed like the way people spoke about alcohol was so different than how they spoke about cannabis or how they spoke about, I don't know, like psilocybin or LSD. Like it was just so different. So, just like growing up understanding or just like, yeah, just having this feeling that like, okay, alcohol is good, these other things are bad. And then doing my own research later and realizing that substances affect your brain and some are legal for political reasons. And sometimes there's not like a specific rationale behind it. But yeah, what about you all?
I feel like we just didn't talk about it when I was like quite young. I think it was more so alcohol use because my grandfather, like my paternal grandfather, when like I did live with my dad, used alcohol, and I could see the way that he used it as coping and like how much pain that he was in. So we spoke about alcohol, but it was once again not as stigmatized. Like we in those moments, I think you're allowed to use alcohol, you just can't get to like that point. It'll be like there's a spectrum and like it's fine. It was never an issue with alcohol, it was more so an issue with like how it was being used. And I think that's how it was framed in our household, if not talked about at all, to be honest. But I don't think cannabis was mentioned at all until the whole hookah cannabis situation with my mom. But I came home and she's like, what's that smell? And it's like, what are you talking about? And then so I mean I was honest. I tell my mom like everything now. So I'm glad I got to that point where we could have a really open conversation about most things. And even if I think because I'm an adult now, there was a shift. But before it was very like, I'm your mom, you're gonna listen to what I say and do what I say because I sacrificed this much for you to be here. And it's true, she sacrificed so much. But I think now there's a mutual respect. Like she sees me as an adult, like someone who is like willing to do anything for my family and like is hopefully a potentially stable adult. So I think for her now, like it's not as much, she'll express her distaste with something, but it's never like, so I'll disown you for that, or like you'll be a disgrace to the family. I think more now I can tell based on the looks on her face and how she engages with me that she's not happy with it. But I think there has been some progress throughout the course of our relationship as I've transitioned into adulthood, where if I brought it up, we could have a conversation and she'd be honest, but I'd still be her daughter at the end of the day. And I'm glad, because if you asked me that like 10 years ago, I don't know if I could say that.
I think just reflecting a lot of the conversations I had, particularly with my mom, about like kind of these type of things. And for context, she has a healthcare background in nursing. So, I mean, I just knew from early that all these things were not happening. There was no drinking, there was no smoking, nothing. And even when the conversation came up, like I would hear like the worst case scenario of like, there was this one guy and he drank and, and next thing you know, and I was like, whoa, like I didn't know that all these things could happen. Like from a young age, like anytime that conversation would come up, I could hear, like, I can still remember a story of like the most extreme thing that could happen if you drink or smoke. And yeah, it just wasn't a thing. I mean, I could have a conversation openly, but like in my mind, I was like, well, this is a big risk, like just to have a smoke or just to have a drink, right? So
I have a question. So how did we go through that process of balancing those risks in our minds? Like the thing that our parents mentioned to us, the like very fear-based concepts around like drugs, which in some ways are valid, like we've said, but then also still some of the benefits that come with cannabis and other drugs. Like how did we as youth make that decision for ourselves, weighing both of those sides? Was that a process for you, or did you kind of just proceed?
I can go for that. For me, I think this is where I think personal experience is very helpful. And not to say go experiment and have your own opinion on every type of substance, right? But I think just being around, acclimated around different people who are using different things or not using different things, and just hearing different perspectives. I guess as you get older and you're more educated in those pieces and have more life experience, you just start to get curious, right? Like, you hear a story and then you see something and it doesn't add up to the story you heard, and you see it again, right? And this person smokes every day and everything's going fine, and they're graduating and they're going to university, and then there's also the people who do that and things aren't working out as fine, right? So then you start to get curious, well, why is it working for this person and it's not working for this person, right? And trying to like decipher that, still at an arm's length. And then I think as you kind of gain that comfort and familiarity, you decide like what it's going to look like for you, right? Like, so maybe you decide, okay, well, maybe it's because this person's using too much. That's what's causing the problem. So maybe if I didn't use so much, it wouldn't be an issue, right? So I think for me, it was more so just trying to, and not to say that I was just kind of sitting there like analyzing every situation, but just trying to figure things out before I kind of decide to engage in something or not. I'm not one to kind of just go in blind and just for the best. I have to kind of observe and do my own research, and yeah.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Kevin. I feel like I had the similar like experience with just figuring it out, because I feel like, and I think the biggest thing for me was like, first of all, like coming here and realizing a lot of the things like I was told was like a lie. And that was like, well, when I was like, more curious. But then I think when I started, even before I started using, and I'd seen weed affect some people in a certain way and others in a different way, then I realized it's really like situational. Like I know like there's some of my friends who like are just like, I can't use cannabis because it doesn't agree with me. And like that as well, it was even like gave me more like curiosity type of thing. Like, okay, like it doesn't necessarily have like, it's not bad, but like some people just can't use weed and like it has certain effects on them and things like that. So I feel like I had that same like process of just like analyzing people around me, their use and like their level of use, like how much they use and like also what they use it for and things like that. Because I know like one of my friends who's on ADHD meds can't use cannabis. It just affects her really negatively and things like that. And like, yeah, so I think it's just like from just watching people around me, and that also kind of helped me to like ease into it a little bit, I think, and made me feel a little bit more comfortable, because I started to realize like maybe I'll be okay, maybe I won't, but I won't know until I try, I guess. And that's kind of how I got to where I was with it, I think.
Yeah, I would say I was the complete opposite, which like I think when I found out like information about cannabis that I guess debunked some myths that I heard growing up, it just made me distrust adults, especially like folks that would come into the classes that were like trying to do harm reduction work, and I was like, no. So I definitely like did my own research, which like looking back, like this is before like I had access to like testing kits and like, you know, like naloxone was readily available. I guess like fentanyl wasn't so much like as like prevalent, but yeah, I definitely like my friends and I were our own exhibitionists in that regard, which like looking back like does scare me. Truly, it scares me in a lot of ways, just because I wasn't using as safely as I could. There was another point in there, but it'll come back. But I guess with cannabis, yeah, a lot of my friends were also consuming, so like definitely like comparing our experiences and taking our time. But I also fell to like different online platforms like Reddit and Arrowwood, which is like a harm reduction website, to like see what people's experiences are like with different substances and cannabis, and like how different forms of cannabis can affect you. But yeah, that's a really interesting question, Chantal, because it's I feel like a lot of young people out there are wanting answers and are wanting the truth, and some do experiment themselves. And it's like, this is why harm reduction is so important, because folks need to know, like, if you are curious how to use safely, no one told me how to use substances safely, and I had to really go out of my way to do so. And you know, some friends didn't do that, and it caused harms, and it does like really scare me, and it's disappointing that I mean, I'm grateful that like now we're having these conversations, but it's a long time coming. Yeah. What about you, Chantal? Sorry, Kevin.
I was just going to say, like, I think it's a challenge because like we're so used to trying to find concrete answers, and a lot of times there's no concrete answer, right? So in terms of like, how is cannabis gonna affect you, right? I'm sure all of us are gonna have a different answer in terms of what that is. But that's not necessarily the message that's being promoted, at least in the past. I think more so now in terms of like cannabis education, right? It's like, if you use this, you know, it's gonna be the end of the world, and you know, your life is gonna collapse. And that's kind of, you know, if you think of all those, like, I'm not sure if you remember some of those like don't do drugs like type of commercials back then. It was always this fear-based, like, you know, like if you want to have a successful life, like these two don't add up, right? But I think just kind of with age and experience, you realize like, well, that's everything, right? Like if I think of something as simple as like sugar, right? Like some people tolerate sugar very differently than others, right? Whether they have a chronic condition or not. So what I can eat doesn't mean you can eat, right? Like, or what I can use doesn't mean agrees with you, right? So I think there is a balance between just kind of being informed and also understanding and learning about yourself and understanding how your body works. And, you know, we talk about mental health and being honest with yourself to say, like, you know, where are things at currently with my mental health, right? Like, is it a risk if I, you know, if I dabble into this or that, right? Like, am I in a place where I feel like that's something that I should be experimenting with, right? Or maybe I should just kind of focus on stabilizing the situation here. Then I can reevaluate if this is something that I might be curious about down the road, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where the like harm reduction in the context of primary care comes in, because it was a couple weeks ago when I was just finishing my like pediatrics rotation, and I love working with like any type of youth, like who are, so for some, like this is probably like their own or their first independent encounter with a healthcare provider, because I think before the age of maybe 14, 15, we often don't ask kids to speak with them alone unless there are these like red flags that are, you know, that come up. And so we always end up talking to them with their parents, and there's gonna be things they're obviously not gonna say in front of their parents. And if you have a primary care physician, like a family doctor, a pediatrician, like someone who you trust, who's an adult, who's well informed, but is also unbiased and is able to engage with you about these conversations, like I think that's a safe space, or I hope it would be a safe space for youth. And there were a couple adolescents like I engaged with who, once you build that trust, they almost feel a sense of relief in telling you like what's going on, because they've had to hide it and they've had to kind of figure things out on their own. And it's like it works out, and then they're like, okay, like I didn't end up A, B, C, D, right? But it's like kids shouldn't necessarily have to be taking that extent of a risk. Like they should be able to engage with doctors, with people like adults that they trust who are not just their parents, so that they are able to build that relationship, build community. I think that's what community is supposed to look like. And unfortunately, I think sometimes it doesn't happen that way. We almost always see parents as like the fence to children, which is fair, but I think as kids are developing a sense of autonomy and they're becoming youth and then becoming adults, like we need to be able to provide them with access to healthcare that engages on topics like this in that non-biased, safe way. Because I'm sure if for a lot of people, like they would feel a sense of relief, and it would be nice to know that we weren't just telling them to not use for the sake of not using, as if it was a moral issue, instead of it being like an actual conversation about helping them weigh the pros and the cons for themselves as people.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. I think, sorry, I'm gonna just shift a little bit just because we're running out of time. I wanted to talk about, I guess, like the healthcare sphere of like cannabis use and drug use, and like, because I also don't have a lot of like knowledge and I'm really just curious. And I guess like my first question for everyone is if they have had any experiences where like with drug use in the medical sphere, like more so Chantal probably, that you like to share, like in relation to Black people. Yeah.
That's Kevin's wheelhouse. So.
I was actually going to ask, and I'll maybe ask it after this, what even for us here, like what our experiences have been just talking to like family doctors or people like that about substance use. I know sometimes, I think what sparked my thought, Chantal, was when you were mentioning kind of just having these open and trusted conversations. And sometimes it's hard to do because there's stigma in the medical community as well. But I can just, I'll kind of touch on your point there, Esther, and then we can kind of see where that goes. But just from my experiences working in, like, I've worked in many hospitals in Toronto, like Sick Kids, Mount Sinai, I'm at CAMH now. And I've seen a lot of perspective in terms of mental health and addictions and what the thought process is just in various areas of the system. And I think there's a lot of stigma in terms of cannabis use in the medical community, and not just physicians, I think just broadly, right? Like, you know, if someone comes in and they're using something and, you know, it's like, sometimes it almost feels like all of a sudden, like whatever you came in for is not relevant. Like everyone's just, oh, like this person smokes, right? Or this person drinks, right? But it's like, meanwhile, you're in there because you have a backache, right? Like, and everyone wants to talk about your substance use and why you shouldn't be doing it. And I think sometimes it discourages people from wanting to disclose because they don't want to be seen as, you know, a drug user or like, or, you know what I mean? So I definitely think now, and I mean, from my perspective at CAMH, I think in the program I'm working at, we're very focused on substance use and mental health. So we're very, like, it's a conscious effort to kind of create that safe space for folks to be able to kind of talk about what they're using and not feel like they're being judged, and even beyond cannabis. So like any type of substance. But that's what I've come to realize, is that that's not necessarily the environment that's created in all aspects of the healthcare system. And I think that's something that we should like push to change. Particularly primary care too, like in your people's family doctors or nurse practitioners, because I mean, not everyone's accessing the hospital. Well, not everyone's accessing primary care as well, but I think that's a more accessible place to have that relationship with someone to say, you know what, like this is what's going on with my health, and to really be able to get credible information, right? Because there's a lot on social media and it's hard to know what's what these days.
I feel like just like based off of that, I haven't, like, I'm thinking about it and I'm like, I've never actually been in a healthcare space where I felt comfortable actually disclosing. My aunt is a doctor and she talked about drug use a lot, and like, I don't know, I just felt like the way she spoke about it, like I felt like I would be judged if I spoke about it. So like I'd get asked, and when I go to like the hospital or to see my doctor, and I like and have never felt comfortable because of that. I feel like once I say that, everything else is like, yeah, it's because you smoke weed or because you use weed. Yeah, oh, you have this because of that. Yeah, and it's made it really hard because I feel like I'm not even comfortable like talking to my family doctor because I just don't like, they may not have that perception, but just the chance that they will, because a lot of people do, it's made it so hard to like talk about. I know for people that I know as well, it's just really hard to actually disclose and like, yeah, I don't know. It's just very difficult. Yeah, I'm just
I have a,
thinking.
I have a follow-up question. If your family doctor broached the topic with you and like maybe gave some background around why they were asking, would that change how comfortable you felt talking about it, especially after if there was some time for you to get to know each other?
Yeah, I think so. I think, yeah, definitely. Um, I think it'll also have to be in the way that they approach it, because I feel like a lot of the times you can just tell in someone's tone and like their behavior that it's like judgmental. So I think if it is because it is something that a lot of people are not comfortable disclosing, if my doctor would approach in a way that's like makes me feel comfortable and like maybe disclaims like, hey, like I'm not gonna like make some preconceived, like I know a lot of people do, but I'm not gonna do that. I just want to understand you and like talk about your use and things like that. I feel like that would help. I feel like if there was more transparency with that, and if um like doctors kind of, I'm sure they know that like people feel stigmatized by their use and did that disclaimer, I feel like a lot of people would be more comfortable talking about their use, because we don't know what's going on in people's minds. And like if we think something, like I'm not going to go to my doctor and say, I feel like you would judge me because I don't know, I feel like they'll change their behavior based on that now that I've said it. So I feel like having that like disclaimer before would be really useful, just from my perspective.
Kevin and Chantal, is there like training around like how to have like Kevin, like I'm sure you might have gone through it, but I guess like in like the like medical sphere, like training around having like non-stigmatizing conversations and like, you know, biases towards patients that like do use drugs. Is there like a training that people go through, or is this like something that's in development or something? Like, are you trying to I feel like you're trying to restructure the medical system. I'm just getting that kind of
Yeah, that was like, that's why I was asking the questions. This is my own
yeah.
research, but no, there are attempts, like it comes up, and throughout medical school, you get taught how to broach certain topics, like how you're supposed to provide a bit of a cushion for specifically sensitive topics where people might feel stigmatized to share how they feel and how they identify, what they use. But I think it can be hard to do. I remember how awkward I was 2 years ago, even last year, even now. There's times where I'm trying to figure out how to ask certain questions, and now I have a bit more of like my own style, but you do get critiqued a lot in terms of how you say certain things, and like there's a level of subjectivity to the people who are asking you or providing you with feedback. So I think for some people, if you're getting feedback about the way you approach certain things and they don't really like how you approach it, even if the patient might like it, then like you might be deemed unprofessional, for example. So I think there's a fine line between the type of a cushion you provide to your question versus like the rubric that they have when they're assessing you as a student. So I think there's definitely room for it to be more intentional. There are attempts, but I think that those things only really matter if they persist throughout the trajectory of your career, where there's also doctors who have, they're 20 years out of school and they're also a part of the healthcare system, and they'll still be the people who are caring for us as youth, right? So I think it shouldn't just be about who's in medical school now, but there should probably be some like continuing education. So it'd be interesting to have those conversations more broadly with like other doctors, because I'm sure if they were able to understand like how they made their patients feel more often, they would change the way they say certain things. And I know I've already been there, and I've only been like 6 months in, and I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have said that way. So there's always room for improvement and for growth, and like we only can know how to do that if we're told. And I would encourage patients who like do have a good relationship with their doctor, who like feel a vibe with them, that like you should probably tell them that what they said made you uncomfortable if it did. But I'm hoping that comes up more with doctors.
I think that piece that you touched on in the education is huge, right? Like there's this idea that because you're in a position of educating, you know everything, right? And that's not, like, I'll be the first person to say that's not the case at all, right? Like, and some people are going to be upset to hear that, but like right down to like how you write your notes or how you speak, and don't do this or say it. Listen, I'm going to do it my way, right? And I can do that now because I'm working, right? And I mean, there's standards that I have to follow and stuff, but it's like when you're asking, ask these questions and into it this way. There's sometimes I just say, like, do you smoke? Like that's how I ask it, right? Like, and they'll laugh and they'll tell me that they smoke, and I'm like, great, like I got the information that I want, right? Like, if hey, like, what do you think about cannabis? Like, they just, immediately once they kind of hear kind of that tone, like, you're not gonna get accurate information, right? Like, so I think finding your own voice and your own personality and finding an authentic way to say, like, listen, do you do this or not? Like, I'm just trying to help you. Like, if you can communicate that message, I think people are open to sharing. Like, for me, that's worked. For others, maybe that won't work, right? But I mean, you know yourself best. And I think that's kind of the message that I would like to see more in education. Like, use like the use of self, right? Like, use the strengths that you bring to engage the person in front of you, right? So the way Chantal might ask it might be different. The way that I might ask might be different than you, Esther, and so on and so forth, right? And everything is right as long as you're being respectful, as long as you're following, there's obviously standards and things like that. But I think from a pointing at physicians, right? Like, I think we as a system can work towards more like this model of like family health teams, right? And there's other providers like nurses and social workers and dietitians and everyone else who has special expertise in different areas who can help support these conversations, right? So maybe it's the physician who identifies that this is a thing, and then maybe you're connected with a therapist or social worker who might, have more expertise in kind of taking a softer approach to kind of doing that and working together to share that information. I think there's a lot of benefit, and we're seeing, I think, a lot more of those coming up here, at least in Toronto. I'm not sure even broader, but I think it helps to have not even just substance use, but even substance use and mental health. It's a lot to put on one person to know everything, right? And I think the more we're working as a team, it's much better and much more effective.
Yeah, for sure. Just I guess like on that point, I know we've already touched on it a bit, just kind of into the theme of just reflecting on cannabis in the Black community. We've talked about it a little bit, but just if anyone wants to add anything else, how as users and non-users and people in the, I guess, the world, how would we want to change the way it's viewed when it comes to like being Black and the Black experience in cannabis and mental health? Like, what do we, I guess, like if we could like envision what we want for that experience, what would we want for that?
I guess like just for folks to understand that like we're not like a monolith. Like there's so many different ways that people are Black and embrace Blackness, and like we all have our own experience and our own relationship with our own mental health and our own substance use and cannabis use, and that like there's not going to be one model, but compassion is huge for me, and I feel like that's the crux of harm reduction. That's at the center, is just compassion, and as Kevin was saying, like just being authentic and gentle with folks and to listen to people, because everyone's experience is different, and have conversations like this, because they really don't happen enough, especially amongst young folks. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part. That relationship is huge, right? Like, it's the most important part, right? Like, I misspeak all the time. I say things and I'm like, that's probably not the best way of what, but I think because of that relationship, and folks can kind of see like when you're being genuine, or when someone's trying to disrespect you, right? Like there's this feeling that you have, and I think when you present yourself as not that person, like we're all human, we're going to make mistakes, right? But allow yourself to fumble on your words and find those words over time, and it's going to shift, right? As the knowledge shifts. But I think that's okay. And I try to put myself in that situation, right? So like, let's say I had something I wanted to talk about, like how would I want the person to approach me, right? And I'll try to approach it from that perspective, because at the end of the day, like, we can be in healthcare, right? But I mean, we all have our doctors, we all have our own health concerns. So we're all patients too, right? And I think it's important to understand that it's fluid, right? Like in one setting, someone might be telling me about their use, and another setting I might be telling someone else about mine, right? And just to kind of humanize that experience, it's not just like sitting there with your checklist and having 2 minutes to talk to someone, like allowing time for that relationship to be built so that people are comfortable telling you what's going on. Because at the end of the day, your practice is only going to be as good as the information you're getting, right? And if you're not setting that space where you're getting accurate information, like, it's not going to be good for anybody.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think from like a personal perspective, I think there's also a need for like self-compassion, that as people are reflecting on their own mental health and decisions that like we make in the context of struggling mental health. Definitely times I made decisions where I was like, I don't think I should have done that. And you like hoard that guilt and that shame. And whether it's about cannabis or just like other mental health coping strategies more broadly, I think there does need to be a strategies around self-forgiveness and like building community so that you can reflect on use. And just because that you made decisions that you are perhaps like not the proudest of, or you want to kind of change the types of coping mechanisms that you use, I still think there's a process of healing that comes through that and engaging with people and talking about it. But then also this process of like building what you want your coping to look like. Like we all have a sense of like agency and autonomy that it can be hard to like really embrace that when you're struggling with your mental health. But like, even if you just have a little bit of it, like identify where that autonomy is and start to build back a sense of like a structure of coping that works for you, whether that engages cannabis or not. Because I think when you have that in place, if there is a crisis that happens, then you have something to fall back on, a foundation, and it'll look like what you want it to look like, hopefully, if there's intention around it, so that when we are going through the day-to-day like process of living life, that you're able to still be well at the end of it.
Can I ask you a question, Chantal? I don't know if this is appropriate for the platform to ask questions like that, but I'm just going to ask if it's okay. What's your experiences just in medical education and mental health? Like, is it something that you had to seek out, or was it like everybody is going to take these courses, so by the time you're done, you have some type of general knowledge?
It's more so baseline. Like everyone comes in with, like, we're all supposed to learn specific information, but it's still being assessed via an exam, a multiple choice exam at the end. And you can choose to avoid certain information and still pass the exam. So I think there has to be a lot of like there's intentionality behind making sure that you become the type of doctor you'd want to be caring for you. And not even just about being a doctor, like being the type of person that you actually want to engage with more broadly. So I think for us, like if you aren't intentional, then you're not going to be good at what you do. And you need to like be striving to continue learning every day. I also think that personal mental health is going to obviously play a role in how you care for other people, whether you're caring for them as a doctor or as a family member, as a friend. So if you like your mental health is not in check, and what I mean by that is like, it doesn't have to look a specific way, but if like you are not satisfied with where you're at or with where you're going, then it's going to be really hard for you to engage with and care for other people in your life. And I think like when you have a position of authority, like of being a doctor, you need to make sure that you're also considering your own mental health. Otherwise, like the trauma you're experiencing, you're going to push right back onto your patients, and like you're going to be the cause of their trauma and them not accessing the care that they need, right? So there's definitely a cycle of mental health that happens, and it's unfortunate if it is not acknowledged, but I think it can be a really beautiful and vulnerable thing if you do have those types of relationships with yourself and with your patients.
I think just in the interest of time, that's honestly a good way to end their conversation. Unfortunately, we didn't get to touch on everything, but I feel like this conversation was so enriching and I learned so much, and like it was so, I've never been able to share like this or like even hear experiences like this. So this has been really beneficial. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for being in this space and for sharing and being vulnerable and just being open. Yeah, thank you for the conversation. I'm not sure if anyone has anything they want to say before we finish the recording.
I just want to say thanks to whoever is involved in kind of putting things like this together. Like, I think these are conversations that we need to continue to have. Whoever was involved in that process, hats off to you, and hopefully we can do more things like this.
Yeah, and thanks for moderating, Esther. And you're like so good at it, killed it. So, I mean, that doesn't have to be included in the recording, but I want to give you your props because you deserve it.
Yeah, and your questions are so good. It just flowed so nicely. I feel like we could have like another hour or two. Yeah, and I've learned so much from everyone here, and it's just so amazing to have a space. I just feel comfortable, like even like sitting on panels and talking about like more like formal ones and talking about my experience can be intimidating when there's like 50 people watching me. I'm like, oh my god, you know, like you still feel that like shame and like you know that imposter syndrome a little bit. So it's nice to like have these conversations in casual settings. So yeah, thank you, and thank you, Esther, for setting this up.
Thank you, everyone. And that brings us to the end of the conversation. Yeah.